morning to everybody. I'm so delighted to meet with you and to see Ajay also on this show and to make my acquaintance with Ramohar Reddy ji. Um, I have known Manthan for some time, as Vikram said, and I've greatly admired how two people who earn their living through doing something else spend so much of their emotional energy trying to build up a forum where ideas can be shared and people can listen to new ideas. It's very much in line with what our Vedas have prescribed that society must have upasana, aranyaka, and Upanishad, which really means it must have discipline, it must have process, it must have knowledge. And that Vedic um, recommendation is exactly what Manthan is promoting. So thank you very much for having me over. It's a great pleasure to be with old friends. It is Sunday morning, and those who are regulars at Manthan, like I am, will know that the subjects they discuss are usually about politics, diplomacy, culture, economy, social issues. Uh, so it's unusual for them to talk about business institutions as a subject. Uh, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I am recognizing that there are a lot of claimants for your attention, election results, updates on the pandemic. But I hope to make it worthwhile for you to spend a little time that you have devoted for this. And if you're not here, I hope you'll see it later on the YouTube channel. I would like to believe that I have a strong case to persuade you that common citizens, even those who are not concerned with business, have a great reason to take interest in this point about business and institutions. I always like to begin such a talk by summarizing the essence of what I want to say. In case somebody says that that's terribly boring, I don't want to listen to this guy, it gives you the option. But hopefully, you'll say, well, that's an unusual view. Let me listen to the rest of it. I believe that the single big reason that India is falling behind in its economic progress compared to other societies, I'll repeat, like Minister Nirmala Sitaraman. The single big reason for India falling behind in economic progress compared to other societies is our inability to develop honest enterprise and leading institutions. China and India had the same per capita income not so long ago, 30 years ago. Today, China is 5 times India, and that is dramatic. Subject today is not about China, but I want to use that as a moniker to tell you why I believe it is important that people understand what is honest business and enterprise. Um, if you don't have clean petrol in the engine, the car can't gather speed. And I want to show you why business and enterprise is the petrol in the engine. So I have this idea that there are 3 E's of society. It's not an original idea. It's put together from old Greek philosophy and so on. Business or enterprise, as I prefer to call it, is at the heart of society. People engaged in enterprise, certainly in our country, do not appreciate their contribution to society. And those who are unconnected with enterprise think business as an instrument of ruthless money making. Both have a point of view, but I would like to believe that my perspective is different. Right through history, great societies have been built on what I call the 3 E's, arranged in concentric circles. The innermost circle is enterprise. The second circle is what I call education. And the third circle is what I call eudaimonia. So let me say a few words about each without getting philosophical, though on a Sunday morning it's probably won't be out of place. Enterprise encompasses activities of trading, manufacturing, digital. Enterprise includes activities like trading, manufacturing, and digital. It also includes players, large scale, small scale, multinationals, everybody. It is enterprise that generates jobs in society. It is enterprise that generates income for people. It is enterprise that produces spending power amongst consumers. Underdeveloped enterprise means underdeveloped incomes. And we have all seen what happened during the recent lockdown. If at all you need experimental evidence of this. I said the second circle is called education. I use education in a very broad sense, not primary and secondary school, which of course I include, but I include education as a civilizational advancement of the society. Arts, humanities, culture, sports, public health. I call all of these education, where a certain level of cultural advancement or enhancement is involved and society needs it. And if you have the energetic waves of enterprise in a society, can the boat of education be lifted? A placid lake where there's no energy and there's no enterprise cannot lift the boat of education. And society desperately needs education, read that as civilizational advancement. The third circle and the last circle I'm referring to is called eudaimonia. That might require just a word of explanation. It's a Greek word which means a feeling of well-being. Acha lagta hai, I'm feeling good. Contentment, well-being. It's only when you reach that stage that you can start thinking of philosophical and spiritual matters. Indeed, India must have had eudaimonia because the rich cultural tradition that we have of philosophy suggests the Greeks have that, and certainly the Indians have it. I therefore believe, for these three reasons, using this 3E model, that society must be respectful and encouraging of honest enterprise. I keep adding the word honest because there is a widespread perception that there are dishonest people, and I'm sure enterprise has dishonest people as well, which brings together culture, humanities, economic advancement, public health all together. And if you look at the golden ages of history, which all of us have studied the same books, Roman civilization, the Ming dynasty in China, the Mughal Empire in India, the Ottoman Empire, the Renaissance period in Europe, all were characterized, all of them, without exception, were characterized by the exuberance of enterprise, education, and eudaimonia. And in 70 years of our independence, if we haven't reached, there are many, many reasons, and there are many experts far more competent than I, but I believe it's because the core engine, there's no petrol in the engine. And we have not figured out how to get the petrol in the engine, good quality petrol. So I believe it's a good thing on a Sunday morning to have taken away your attention from whatever else might have occupied you today to speak for half an hour on a subject which I believe is of some importance. And I hope if Manthan sees the value of this, you'll get other speakers also on the subject of. I've used the word making an enterprise into a business institution. So I need to explain to you what is an institution and what is a shaper, because I've used the word shaping of business institutions. I don't want to be pedantic, but think of an institution, think of Taj Mahal in Agra, and think of the Park Circus Cemetery in Kolkata. Both are Kabristans. If you cut out the effulgence of poetry, both are Kabristans. But which one is an institution? It doesn't require to be proven. Think of the Victoria Terminus station in Mumbai. It's now called Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus. And think of Begumpet railway station in Hyderabad. I don't think you need to prove which is an institution. So the moment I use the word institution, you get a sense of grandeur, of awe, something that's long lasting, which is a social pleasure and service to society. And that's what I require you to remember today when we talk of an institution in the context of a business enterprise. It must generate awe, it must be long lasting, it must be of service to people. And then what's a shaper? I've used the word shaper, I've not talked of leader. A shaper is the glue around which institutions are built. He is not the person who built the institution. It's the people who built the institution. Sher Shah Suri did not touch a single brick when the GT road was laid. I can guarantee you Shah Jahan did not put his hand on any of the marble that was used in the Taj Mahal. And therefore, I use the word shaper to be the glue around which the institution was built. The institution was built by people who are unnamed and anonymous. So the shaper develops a grandiose idea and a detailed plan with the help of these unnamed people. And that's how institutions are built up. Homi Bhabha and the atomic energy establishment. Many other examples I have taken. So I have now defined what is a shaper, what's an institution, and I'm using those as monikers for honest enterprise. So that I don't keep on saying honest enterprise, suggesting that there is a dishonest enterprise about which somebody else can speak. That's not my purpose. But I like the word institution because it automatically conveys this feeling of awe, grandeur, long lasting, sustainable, and in harmony with its environment. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got inadvertently involved in an applied research project. You know, for a guy who spent 50 years in corporate sector like Unilever and Tata, you wouldn't expect me to even use the word research. And indeed, I'm fortunate that I happened to join a team of 5 academic people. So I'm able to pass myself off as having participated in the applied research. These people are all management academics at the SP Jain Bhavans. Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan have a SP Jain Institute of Management in Mumbai. And I just like to mention their names because they were co-researchers and co-authors of these books that you see behind me, which are the books we've published. Dr. Tulsi Jayakumar, Dr. Pallavi Modi, Dr. Sushmita Srivastav, Dr. Vidyut Lata Dheer, and Mr. M.S. Rao. So these are the 5 academics, and I got together in a rare act of stupidity or whatever you want to call it and said, can't we work together to try to define an institution, a shaper, and see how it can be useful to India? Because we came from the principle that we need more institutions in India. Now, it might interest you to know that there's a lot of foreign research, particularly American, and foreign publications and books and so on how they built great institutions or excellent companies. The Tom Peters book on lessons from excellent companies, the Good to Great by Jim Collins, the Timeless Ventures by Haruo Funabushi. So all these are available in the public domain. But we were surprised to find that apart from a few hagiographies, there was no Indian research and publication, at least we could not find. If there is, I apologize in advance. Some significant piece of research and pedagogy about how an Indian institution is built. And I must say, Indian institutions are built up in an Indian society, in an Indian environment. There are differences. I shall cover that, touch upon it as we go along. The second thing we found, Vikram mentioned that no better person than me because I've worked in Lever and Tata, but it is not about the Lever and the Tatas. There are books about Tata, there are books about Godrej, Bajaj, uh, you know, great books. I call them all Gen L companies, Gen C companies, Generation Centurion. Centurion because the founders did it 150 years ago in a different mahal, in a different environment. They are dead and gone. And we've just got some records of it. We wanted to go to Gen L companies, liberalization companies, people who came into the public domain and prominence in the last 50 years. If you had walked around the streets of this great financial capital of India, Mumbai, back in the 80s, and you said HDFC, you'll say, what? If you said Biocon, the word wasn't invented. If you said Marico, you'll say it doesn't exist. If you said TCS, they'll say, what is TCS? Tata we've heard of, but what is TCS? And so on. So these were companies which had an IPO in the 2000. TCS had an IPO in 2002, I think. Um, Biocon had an IPO in 2003. So they're all young companies. And so we chose 5 criteria to say, let's take contemporary people. You know, if you want to say what makes a great cricketer, and you keep on studying Polly Umrigar and Ari Contractor, you'll get one outcome. If you see what young people are doing today, you get a different outcome. We set ourselves 5 criteria. They are by no means perfect. They are entirely defensible. And we were not giving awards to people for being great companies. We were merely identifying exemplars whom we could possibly research. What were the 5 criteria? First, the company came into public consciousness in the last half century, and I've explained that already. The second thing that we said is it must already be a successful enterprise with appurtenances of becoming an institution. We are not awarding a prize. We are not telling people that, you're crowned, like some of our pink papers do with startups and make them exemplars. We are not doing that. We are saying they have all the appurtenance of becoming an institution. You can judge this only in due course of time. Third, and very important, that the company we choose to research has a very, very high reputation in the public consciousness. Like all human creation, it is not perfect and you can't find flaws with it. But by and large, they represent very high standards. You would not hesitate to invest in the share of that company if you wanted a 10-year perspective, because you would not worry that they would do something with your money, bad with your money. Fourth, that the company makes a meaningful difference to society, appropriate to its size and uh, its business. It produces great financial results for its investors, but it may not be the best in its peer group. Now, this is the big difference between the way approach we took and the way American books they create a ladder and they choose the one who's got the highest return to shareholders. We said, no, that's not what we want to do. We look for the ones with the highest return to stakeholders. And the fifth and the last item we had was that the shaper must be available for us to interview. Otherwise, what kind of research is it if you just go through some old papers? On this basis, we identified 9 companies. I wrote to all 9, inviting them to participate in the research. Now, when you participate in this kind of research, you're throwing open your doors to outsiders. 6 of them responded and agreed to participate. They are Tata Consultancy Services. We were very lucky. The late Mr. Fakir Chand Kohli was still alive at that time. We could interview him. And Mr. Ramadurai, his very distinguished successor. Deepak Parekh of HDFC Group. Mr. A.M. Nayak of Larsen and Toubro. Uday Kotak of Kotak Mahindra Bank. Harsh Mariwala of Marico. Those were the 6 companies. And the 5 academics and I pooled our calories together and intellectual capabilities to research these people. By the way, these 6 companies, which I am calling institutions either made or in the making, account for 1/3 of the market value of the Bombay Stock Exchange. 1/3. I mean, they are big, powerful companies. They are not just money-making machines. They happen to make good money. They spend over 3,000 crores in CSR every year. Just these 6 companies. I'm leaving aside the others. And of course, when we started to write about the books, we wrote more about these things. Now, the question can arise, what is the research methodology? You keep calling it applied research. Now, we did not want to do academic research. Academic research, with no disrespect to academics, is stuff that academics publish, academics read, and it gets read in academic fora. It has its value because academic research advances the frontiers of knowledge. We wanted applied research, knowledge that could be used. In fact, the motto of SP Jain Institute in Mumbai is applying thought to practice. So it suited our motto very well in the institution. And so we wanted something that others could learn from and emulate. And therefore, what we did for our research methodology is to spend a lot of time, 700 hours we clocked in terms of desk research, validation of a preliminary model, and detailed interviews with CEOs, competitors, employees. We started in 2018, April, and we finished last year. It was an exhaustive exercise, and Rupa Publications published 6 books, which you're seeing here behind me. Each book is slim, it's only 150 pages. Now, we had the option of making a 900-page book. It would have looked really scholarly. But we said, are we writing for scholarship or are we writing for value? because not everybody, we want people to read the books, not to buy the book and keep it in their library, which is what happens to many 900-page books. So publisher Rupa Publishers helped us to design these 6 books, 140, you can read it on a flight from Bombay to Calcutta, and in a very readable style, but necessarily with the lesson that we wanted to. And so the question arises, what is the big lesson? What is this Brahma mantra that you guys have discovered? Now, the one thing about all Brahma mantras is once it is stated, you say, what's so great about it? If I say Bhur Bhuvas Swaha, you say, well, what's so great about it? Okay, I can explain the meaning, you still say what's so great about it. But you have to see the nuance of it. And that's what I seek to do in the next 15 minutes. We stumbled upon, remember, when you stumble upon something, it is a great revelation for you, maybe not for somebody else. We stumbled upon through the research of my 5 academic colleagues and their application of mine to what we call the MBA, mindset, behavior, and action. And we converted that into a model. We claim no originality for it. We had a lot of academic research go into, but we had to, my academic colleagues came out with 500 pages of research papers. Being the guy that I am with my background, I said, listen, I'm not used to getting 500 pages. If you can't convert it into 1 page, nobody's going to read it. And so we get it into 1 page. It's called the MBA grid, Mindset, Behavior, Action Grid. It appears in every book, the research methodology and the MBA grid. So it's visible for people to see. And I have no doubt that somebody will say, these are some of the flaws in it, we can improve on it. And that's the purpose of any research, to somebody to build better and make it better. But I want to explain to you without getting pedantic what this MBA is, because we want, India has, believe it or not, we have 69 million enterprises. 69 million enterprises. But of the 69 million enterprises, only 19,000 have a capital of more than 10 crores. Now just imagine, we are running a universe of pygmies. And we need that 19,000 to become 190,000 and 1.9 million. And that's the effort to which I believe India's future lies, create good, honest enterprise. So we conjured up in our own minds the image of a river. Human action emanates from the Gangotri of a person's mind. What is your mindset? The mindset is the Gangotri. And each person has a mindset. We all have mindsets. That from that Gangotri, the mindset manifests downstream as a small river, what I call behavior. Because your mindset makes you behave in a particular way. If you are politically inclined towards one party, that mindset makes you behave in a particular way. If you're mentally, your mindset is that I must make lots of money, that makes you behave in a certain way, and so on and so forth. But as that little river grows into a massive river, think of the Ganga, starting at Gangotri, then becoming a river somewhere near Delhi and Haryana. And then as it comes down towards Allahabad and Bengal, it becomes a mighty river. And that is the actions of the karma of a person. Ultimately, the world judges you by karma. We think of the Ganga the way it appears in Allahabad, Varanasi, and Bengal, rather than as the Gangotri. Small mindset leads to a big river. So think of the mindset, behavior, and action as the Gangotri, the manifestation, and the actual karma of the company. So we had 3 columns. I'm avoiding using PowerPoint charts. I was very tempted because of my own background, but I said, we are flooded with PowerPoint charts. It's better that if I can't explain it to you, visually tickle your mind, then what the hell am I doing here? So think of a column M, the second column B, the third column A. Horizontally, we put down 8 habits. We hypothesized this from the research, and then constructed it. So what are the 8 habits? They are people orientation. I'm just going to mention them because you possibly can't go through all of them in the time available. One is people orientation. We just given them monikers. The second is called critical thinking. The third is called short versus long term. The fourth is called orbit changing. The fifth is called levers of change. The sixth is called break barriers. And then there is cyclical learning. And last is stakeholder orientation. I have run through them very quickly, and it's not my intention to run through all of these 8. But I want to explain or bring to your mind, conjure up a picture where you have 3 columns and 8 rows. So there are 24 boxes for each company. And when we went to the company through our interviews, we populated these boxes through our questions. So now you can imagine there were 6 companies who agreed to participate, and each one had 24 boxes, and we populated these 24 boxes. And 24 multiplied by 6 gave us 144 boxes. And that was the data set with which we reworked our hypothesis. And it gave us some commonalities. And it is a commonality that we have extracted. What is it that Uday Kotak does and Deepak Parekh does which are similar? What is it that is common amongst all these 6 people? None of them thinks that he's similar to the other guy, by the way. With these words like mindset, behavior, action were news to them as well. They did what their training, instinct, and their values and their mindsets, but there certain common features emerged. And it is that we were interested in our applied research. And we said it's like if you observe Virat Kohli batting and you just try to do what he's doing, including the dress he's wearing, you will not become a Virat Kohli. You have to think about it deeply. You have to practice for hours, and you might make a departure from a Virat Kohli style and yet become a great batsman. So we know that it's a Brahma mantra in the sense that the principle stays, but the practice of it can vary quite a lot. Um, I would like to not spend all my time talking, and therefore I will just keep to some bullet points by way of illustration, and perhaps in the question and answer, if there are audience questions or Vikram or Ram Manohar have any comments, we could take that on board. But I need to just flesh it out a wee bit before I close to not let you feel that I showed you the fruit and it's lying on the branch and I have not said anything at all about it. So I'm just taking the most important 3 habits or practices, as you might call it. Number 1, people orientation. Now that sounds like a motherhood and apple pie statements. I mean, on a Sunday morning, you say, yeah, I've heard of that. Let me give it the examples because unless I'm anecdotal about it, when you read the books, you'll get the full flavor of it, of course. Uh, take TCS as an example. There were less than 10 database experts in Mumbai when TCS pioneered the creation of skilled human resources. How can you set up a company when the whole city has only 10 database experts? During the 70s, Mr. Kohli oversaw the development of the first MTech program in IIT Kanpur. And one of the products of that was Narayan Murthy, who set up Infosys later. The credit goes to Narayan Murthy, not to Kohli, but that he thought there is a need for this kind of education. Mr. Ramadurai took over from Mr. Kohli in 1996. The Indian IT industry was already growing at 40% per year. Today, it looks like a fairy tale which has been told many times over with wealth that has multiplied. But you have to think, I started my career as an IT man back in 1967. So I have an empathy for what these guys, how patient they must have been and how they must have worked. Because I got fed up and I quit, quit IT, maybe to my disadvantage, but that's the reality. I changed my career path. Ram, as we call him, and his team initiated a program called Ignite. And that was a program to train non-engineering graduates to become business consultants. They didn't get MBAs coming out of the trees, which they could pluck. They trained their own people. So this development of human capital was a very important part of what TCS did. It just didn't happen overnight. Mind you, TCS is not the only one. I give full credit to the Infosys and the Wipros and the HCLs and so on and so forth as well. But they had to take people who not even necessarily fluent in English, who could travel the world and speak the language of TCS. TCS has managed to increase its employee strength 40 times over 23 years. TCS recruits and parts with as many people as Tata Steel has recruited over the last 100 years in one go, you know. They do it every year. So you can imagine the scale at which they're doing it. And yet they have the lowest attrition rate in the industry. And when I use the word people orientation, I don't mean only employees. I mean your attitude to shareholders, to community. I include all of that. I'm just taking some examples. So if you take HDFC, which has been so notably chaired and headed by Deepak Parekh. Deepak Parekh is a true shaper of HDFC Group. His uncle must get the credit, Hasmukh Bhai Parekh, for thinking of the idea of housing finance. I mean, in his generation, and that's my father's generation, you didn't think of a house till you were 59 or 60. Sometimes even at 61, you didn't have a house. You had nothing to offer by way of collateral. And they hit upon this idea, Hasmukh Bhai and Deepak ably assisted him, that the honor of the Indian housewife is my collateral. If she takes a loan, she will make sure it is returned. And they devised a whole system, which is described in the book, of course. And for those who know HDFC, you probably know it, which makes Deepak say the following statement. I'm quoting from the book. HDFC hires ordinary people and trains them to do extraordinary things. That's a very nice statement. That you are taking people in Muzaffarpur, in Kanpur, in Tirunelveli, and you're not going to get an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad going and living his life in Tirunelveli, that's for sure. So you take a Tirunelveli man and make him extraordinary. So that's what I mean by people orientation. One more example before I move to the next one. Harsh Mariwala and Marico. Marico is a carve out conceptually from the parent company, which is a commodity oil company, Bombay Oil Industries. Marico said, we are going to give freedom to our employees. Now, all CEOs say the same thing. We give freedom and creativity and rely on people. They keep their own attendance and leave records. There is no HR department which fills up a column and then the boss signs it, which is what most of us are used to anyway. Um, the same thing in Kotak Mahindra Bank. So let the organization be built by the people. And this is why I said the shaper is the glue. The builders are the people. And without the glue, you can't build. But without the builders, the glue will not work. And this is the great connection that Anil Nayak of Larsen and Toubro, he's got a formidable record and personality, but he's known to ask a very simple question. What ideas do you have to transform our company? And if somebody says, sir, I think we are doing this right and wrong, Anil Nayak listens. So I was very surprised to hear from these six people independently. By the way, I was the common factor because I was meeting them along with my co-researcher and author. They spend between 25 to 40% of their time on people. They don't leave it to the HR department. This is not a reflection of the HR department. The HR department assists them in doing it, but they personally spend thinking about people 25 to 40%. Now that's the mark of a true institution builder. And therefore, it comes on top of my list for me to highlight. I want to take one other habit called critical thinking, and then maybe I'll just wind up so that we have enough time for interaction. Otherwise, if you've written 900 pages as my co-authors and I have, one could go on and on for a very long time. Critical thinking is the ability to be a geologist and an astronomer at the same time. So what do I mean by that? If you send a geologist and an astronomer in a spacecraft and they land on Mars or the moon or wherever, very likely as soon as they land, apart from thanking God. The geologist will take out his toolkit and he'll start digging the ground. But that's his training. He'll see what's inside this surface. The astronomer, on the other hand, will take out his toolkit and start looking up at the skies and saying, what is this a part of? If you ask the geologist and the astronomer to write down a diary, they will write very different diaries. Because one is looking at what is in it, one is looking at what is this a part of. And that is the difference between a scientist and an artist. An artist is always looking at what is this a part of. The scientist is looking at what is inside this. And the ability to combine the scientist and the artist is what makes a critical thinker. The one who can think of non-obvious solutions to problems rather than look at the obvious solutions. And I'll just take one example to illustrate this. Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw in Biocon. She's an accidental entrepreneur, as she herself describes it. She's a woman entrepreneur. It's not easy in our country and society. So great kudos to her. But she trained to be an enzyme uh, science graduate, for brewing, for the lovely glass of beer that we have. From there, she went on through a set of circumstances, which I will not go into in the interest of time, to enter what is called solid state fermentation. Now, since I'm not a mumbo jumbo guy, and most of you in the audience too are not, solid state fermentation is a technique of fermenting materials to produce new outcomes, but it requires, it's a fairly robust system, but you must be on the job all the time. So it's like cooking yourself. You must have full control over the processes. Uh, she made a success of it and had a business running. And then she found that there is something else other than the solid state fermentation, which is called deep tank fermentation, wet fermentation, to use a layman's language. And she had a choice. Should I change? Now, most companies don't change the business they started with. They'll hang on to it forever. She said, will I be a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond? If I stay with solid state fermentation, I'll be a big fish, but the pond itself is only this big. Whereas if I go to solid state deep tank fermentation, I can be a small fish, but in a big pond. And it required critical thinking to engage with your colleagues. And she made the switch. Today, it is not in solid state fermentation. She found a good home for it, got a good amount of capital for it, and changed the course, or pivoting, as the startup people would say. I could go on with more examples of critical thinking. Every company goes through this critical thinking. And the third habit was that I mentioned was short versus long term. And here I'm going to close it not by taking the company examples, but by using a metaphor. And the metaphor is of a mother. A mother is the most wonderful example we have of a person who can combine short-term and long-term thinking. Right now, my daughter just had a second baby, and the house is full of uh, baby stuff going on. And I can tell you that a mother is dealing with a crying baby, changing her nappies, giving her her feed, hassled about it, short-term, but she's always dreaming of the long term. Will my son or daughter become a scientist or a poet or a journalist or a speaker at Manthan or whatever. And mothers are, women in general, but mothers in particular, are fantastic at managing short and long term simultaneously. And in many ways, I would argue that these shapers are like women. Normally, we don't take that metaphor. They're able to deal with short and long term simultaneously. As I said, I can expand on these, but I will hold myself where I am and like to close here by saying and summarizing. Number one, I hope I made your time worthwhile, that honest and good value building enterprises is worth the time of common citizens, at least as much as cricket and politics occupy and Bollywood occupy their attention. Second, that I hope the subject has been a worthwhile addition in the Manthan um, glossary, and that I have at least persuaded you that it's an important enough point to think about. Third, that there is something called an institution which can be shaped, and the shaper of an institution, and there are lessons to be learned. Fourth, that very few people have researched and seen what's in India. We have attempted to do so. I think this is the first building block, and I hope other academics and practitioners will do so and build a body of knowledge which will be uniquely Indian. This point about people orientation was uniquely Indian, far more than many of the Western companies, because Indians work through relationships rather than processes, as we all know. So, thank you very much, Vikram and Ajay, for giving me this opportunity to share a few headlines. I'm very happy to take questions in the available time. I hope I've at least stimulated some interest in the subject. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gopal Krishnan. Vikram, can I ask?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, it was really a fascinating talk, and I think you got the better of the competition on this Sunday morning. A massive study. And, it is a fact that, we don't have enough business studies in India, to understand, how enterprises grow, sometimes how enterprises fail. And I think studies like this will really, not just for the those in the management profession, but for a common citizen who wants to know, how do businesses grow? What is it that makes them important? So I think this is really quite fascinating, and especially what you've highlighted, things like critical thinkers. I think I would like to just come back to that in a moment. Critical thinkers, the people orientation. And this is something new. I mean, yeah, we know that traditionally Indian companies paid attention to people, but that modern Indian companies do, and that is news to me. If I'm not mistaken, there was some time ago, there was a lot of attention being paid to some Brazilian company where a lot of attention was being given to people.
Richard Semler's company. Yeah.
Yeah. But what you have talked about is fascinating. But to begin with, just one question, the list of companies that you have, um, other than L&T, the others are newish companies. I mean, they're 20, 30. I mean, even TCS in its present avatar is about 40 years old, I guess. The question is that shapers, are able to give a vision, able to impact thinking, etc., in the nascent stage. What happens when the company grows? And what is interesting for me is L&T, which has been around for decades, has had a good reputation, always had a reputation, but it was very much seen as a lumbering giant. How is it that in a large bureaucracy, one person like Mr. Naik is able to shake things up, and because you have many stories of other lumbering giants which fail, So this important, this critical thing, I'd like you to, if you could talk a little bit about this, the role of the critical thinker, who can come into an established company and shake things up so much. I mean, this is not to discount the role of Kiran Mazumdar Shaw or Deepak Parekh, and it's just that they're separate categories. And unfortunately, we hear of many established companies which after a point don't go further. Now, how is it that L&T has been able to make the transformation that it has over the past 20 years?
That's a very nice, good question, Ram Manohar. I want to just say this, that if I say who shaped the United States, you can take the original founders, Washington and Jefferson, or you can take Lincoln, or you can take Roosevelt. Depends on which point. But what you mean is all of them have, and that's why they are all in that statues, 4 stone statues, uh, seen as shapers. The example you have taken of Nayak is an example of being the Lincoln, whereas the Washington had already done the job in 1939. The others are people who founded it. They were the Jeffersons or the Washingtons of their companies. So it's, in a sense, we were very happy to get that mix. Now, the question you asked is, when you get a large lumbering giant with an indifferent performance, which is the description you might wish to apply to, which one could apply to Larsen and Toubro. So let's look at Nayak. Nayak, what did he do? That was your question. I think the way we found in our research, this was not to eulogize Nayak, but to give the credit where it's due. You know, just because it's not a hagiography, you cannot take away the credit. The guy came, he was sitting in this company for the previous 30 years, okay, as an employee, as an engineer. He comes from a very modest Gujarati medium education background. He had no fancy ideas about himself, but he had fancy ambitions for the company. When he became the chairman, he seemed to be uh, iconoclastic. He seemed to ask questions which others had not asked. And I give you only two examples to illustrate my point. There are others in the book. They have a site in Hazira in Gujarat. And when that site had to come up, he said, who the hell's going to go and work in this godforsaken place? And he set up a master plan for sourcing and training workers. This is exactly what Dorabji Tata did when Jamshedji Tata identified Jamshedpur. They set up a colony not because they wanted to set up towns, because they said nobody will come and live in this godforsaken place if we don't have school and education and so on. And today, I think Hazira is a great tribute to the fact that, and many other companies have done it, but since we're talking of Larsen and Toubro, I'm mentioning them, you have to think of the hardscape and the softscape at the same time. And that's one illustration. The second one, which I found very interesting, there's a sense of humility that a leader must bring to say, I don't understand this. And here's what happened with Nayak, which was quite interesting. He had now become chairman and managing director. And he said, I don't understand why we are ascribed X value by the stock market. If I want to increase my market capitalization, what do I have to do? Now, you know, financial people can put you through a lot of jugglery. And they put him through that. And he said, yeah, I'm a Dumbo. I'm just a simple mechanical engineer who thinks in Gujarati. So he got his own team to work on this. He got some consultants to help them and broke it down like an algebraic formula into something that an engineer could understand. And he said, now I want to see which of these levers I can influence. And it resulted in some decisions. One example, which he mentioned, is we will not go for small profitable projects. We'll go for large projects. We will not go for projects less than 100. Instead of doing 5 projects of 20, because it takes away too much resource. So this ability to say, I don't understand, the ability to persist, and he called it Project Blue Chip. He said, I want to make Larsen and Toubro. And when he took over Larsen and Toubro, if my memory is right, his market cap was 50,000 crores. He retired after 15, 20 years and it was 250,000 crores. And he says, it's not because the same guys are there. We just understood what is the algebra and which parts of it we need to influence and what actions can engineers take rather than say leave it to the financial people. So I hope I've answered your question. That second part of what Anil Nayak does, many established companies don't when they are sitting in their comfort zone. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gopal. This was a fitting answer. First, I want to introduce to the audience something which I've forgotten to do, and but it's never too late to do a good deed. Ram Manohar has joined our team now. He was earlier editor for EPW, but now runs a wonderful digital magazine called India Forum, and he's one of the leading business thinkers in this country, economic thinkers in this country. And I'm glad that he's there with us, and he'll be with us for some more time. And thank you, Ram, for being here with us. The question I have to you, Gopal, is you also mentioned about honesty, and it's a standard question which many people ask. Is honesty worth the economic resource, which otherwise would be wasted? I would rather be a little dishonest but preserve capital and preserve revenue, preserve profits, rather than being honest and waste my revenue. Is it all about economics? Isn't it all about economics in business?
I am arguing exactly the opposite.
Yes, I can see that.
My argument is, how do you raise your child? You know, you can make your child, you want to make your child into Shakespeare at the age of 5, and you subject that child to certain artificial things. You want that child to be wealthy. You keep telling the child from the smallest age, son, you must have lots of money. And there are parents who do that, by the way. And when the child is 30, he or she thinks in a particular way. There are other parents, hopefully more than the first variety, who say, beta, you have to be a good human being. And this is what a good human being means. I'll tell you the story of the Ramayana, Mahabharata, whatever, whatever. They may have less money, but they are different kinds of citizens. The same thing happens in companies. These are companies that have come up at a time when India was thought to be license permit Raj, corrupt. And I'm not speaking that they have never given a bribe here or there. That was not the course of my inquiry. Show me a human being, including you and me, who has never given even 15 rupees to a ticket conductor to get a third class sleeper ticket. I've done it when I was a student and I could not travel by an unreserved train for 2 days. I took the easy option. I gave $20 to somebody and I got a sleeper seat, third class sleeper. So the idea is that you feel bad about it and you recount it later. So these are companies which have felt that there is no point raising a child, in this case company, without honesty. And today, I think they have proven that it's still possible to be a great value adder. I told you their market cap is 30% of the Bombay Stock Exchange. So they are not pushovers. None of them is less than $7-8 billion. So honesty and honest enterprise are not antithetical to success. That is a very important uh, message that I would like to leave.
And that's a very important point. Thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating talk. I'm going to flag this and go back to it at least a couple of times, and also buy books. I would like to ask the audience to also go to the Amazon link that has been provided in the video and buy the books that Gopal has written. Uh, by now, it would be clear to you how important they are for all of us. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask one question that one of our friends has asked on. It would be nice if Gopal can describe his own achievements and how different it is from those he has written about. Would you like to say something?
Firstly, I'm not self-obsessed to the point of wanting to describe my own achievements, but I have worked in only 2 companies. I'm very lucky in my long life so far. I've had one wife, 2 jobs, and 3 children, and I'm very happy with that. I have never regretted that I don't have more wives or more jobs or more children. Luckily, both these companies are Gen C companies, Unilever and Tata. And whatever I have learned and felt inspired by has been due to these companies. If I've achieved anything, it's because of the chhatra chaya of these companies. But in this piece of research, we did not want to go to Gen C companies because, people are saying, especially when I meet people who are 30, they say, yeah, don't tell me about, 1880 and what some Englishman did to Jamshedji Tata. Wo alag zamana hai. Don't tell me what Gandhiji said. Aage ke liye bolo. They are very inspired by the pink papers writing about startups. They're very inspired by disproportionate growth in a disproportionately short time. They're very inspired by getting to be unicorns in a very short time. And they have questions like, how do I recruit a top class team? How do I recruit good people? How do I keep good values? It's all right, you're a Tata, you can say, I will not give you a bribe and things get held up for 2 years. But we can't do that. This is the kind of issue they have. So we took more recent companies. I must say, though, that my experience in a Unilever or a Tata was not vastly different. In fact, one of the Tata companies, one of the younger Tata companies, TCS, is a member of this sextet of books. And Unilever, I'm not writing a book about, but they are not dissimilar at all. Not dissimilar at all.
While Gopal, you did not write about this, I would like to ask you, what is your opinion on how regulatory institutions have been shaped? For instance, I think that even there is a overarching influence of the let's say someone in the RBI, what the governor is saying, uh, we get to hear about his ideas and everything. But there are many regulatory institutions which have shaped our country. Do you think that on the lines which you have parameterized 24 by, 3 by 8, you think regulatory institutions should also be researched?
Oh, yes, no question about it. In fact, right now, if you look at our institutions, I'm straying away from the business enterprise area just to answer your question, not to change the discussion. Our institutions are under great pressure. Well-formed institutions like the Election Commission, like the judiciary, like the financial regulators are under great scrutiny in the public domain. And I think I am personally not feeling very competent to research them, but building great institutions is something that is certainly worth a study. No argument about it. Because you do need regulation. By using enterprise at the middle of the first circle of the concentric circles, it was not to say that you can just let them do whatever they want and life will work well. It won't. Just like if you inject petrol into a 6-cylinder engine and fire it, it will generate energy, but you need the guiding system of a transmission system, a gearbox, a clutch, to guide that energy in an orderly way to the steering wheels and the four wheels of the car. In the same way, the regulatory system, the governmental system must be supportive of that. So if you have uh, X horsepower coming in the engine compartment, as much of that X as possible should be going to the wheels of the car. And that's what anybody who's designing a transmission system will do. And so regulatory systems are very, very important. I fully agree. And one of our problems, when I say that inadequate attention to enterprise is the bane of India's, and we are searching for that answer over 70 years. We are all searching for that right answer. Uh, if you have a good regulatory system and a good enterprise system, you've now taken the step to education and eudaimonia.
Yeah. Yes, Ram, you had a question. You're muted, Ram.
I was looking at the questions that viewers had asked. One of them is asking this question about, we are focused on large successful companies, which have become large and successful. Now, what about the medium-sized companies, which in small and medium, which in some countries at least have been the backbone in some ways of the industrial structure and even of innovation? Whether in Germany, the small, middle-sized companies, and even in China, not of innovation, but they were driving growth. But what about there? Is there something that we can learn from these companies, whether or not they become large? What is there something that the Indian small, medium-sized companies can tell us about how to drive growth?
That's a good question, a very perceptive question. And the answer is yes. And I'm going to take two examples. We cannot cover everything. We are already six books at 150 pages. We could give competition to Ramchandra Guha on, but his books are far more erudite than what we have written. I'll give you two examples. One is and I'll mention their profile very briefly. You would not have heard of these companies. In fact, I'll give you three examples. One is a company called Surfactant Galactans. Galaxy Surfactants, sorry, the other way around. The second is a company called DMart, which is a public listed company, so you might have heard of it. The third is a company called Conserve Electrical. Now, Galaxy Surfactants was set up by middle-class people with no bank, no different from your father or my father, who had government jobs or something. One was a chartered accountant, one was a chemical engineer. They came to Hindustan Lever back in the 80s to do a summer internship. Somebody thought they were bright and they were tapped to join the company. They said, no, we want to be entrepreneurs back in the 80s. Huh? And they went out and set up this company called Galaxy Surfactants. And they said to Hindustan Lever executives they were in touch with, don't do us a favor, just guide us, mentor us. Today, the former chairman of the board, non-executive chairman, current chairman, are all ex-Hindustan Lever people, retired people. And what Galaxy Surfactants did was to be ethical, set up processes, hire talent. They are a mini Hindustan Lever and they've got a public company. It's an IPO'd company, which doesn't make them a huge, it's not a unicorn. You'll never find Galaxy Surfactants in the pink papers.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. DMart. It's also run by an ex-Hindustan Lever guy, but the promoter is Damani. They are in traditional retail. He set up a grocery shop and is worth several billion. And it has a very good reputation. Conserve Electric was set by a former electrical inspector in the Karnataka Electricity Board. And all it does is to create electronic meters at a time when India didn't know what's an electronic meter. You know, the meter wala used to come and read the meter, write it in a book and go back and they would make a bill for you. He said, electronic meters, you don't have to do that. It is also saving energy. That company, and a book has been written about it by a lady called Hema Hattangadi, who's a member of the family, became successful, large, profitable after going through all its difficulties. And the French company Schneider Electric has come and bought that company because it came to a stage when these people said, we don't have the resources to go further. Schneider Electric was so admiring of this company that they have created a Conserve Electrical division within Schneider Electrical to replicate their business model. So India is full of jewels. And to look for the jewels, you have to search hard, not look at the pink papers.
Vikram, a related question from a viewer, not quite related.
Yeah.
Back to shapers of institutions. How do they build and develop a line of succession? Is there any common strand that did you see in your study of these 6 companies?
You know, of the 6 that we studied, only one has gone through Larsen and Toubro has had a succession of people. TCS has done a marvelous job. You know, Kohli set it up. He handed over to Ramadurai. Ramadurai gave it to Chandra. Chandra has given it to Rajesh Gopinathan. There are 2 things that I found that they do, which may be linked to the answer of your question. And I'd just like to mention the 2. One is they are very focused, when I say people orientation, on creating a density of talent. It is not the single bright spark, the creative genius. They're not looking for an Einstein in their company. You don't need Einsteins to run software companies or hair oil companies, for God's sake, or Hindustan Lever soap company. You need a density of talent.
Yeah.
And they're very focused on that through that 20 to 40% time they spend on it. The second thing that they are very focused upon is candor. Creating the atmosphere and the tone from the top to ask questions and challenge. You know what, in our own tradition, Tarka Vitarka, if you look at old Indian tradition, the argumentative Indian is a product of Tarka Vitarka. And in those companies, if you make and it has a larger public context in which one could view the comment I'm making, though I'm making it in the context of companies. When you suppress dissent, and when you don't have talent density, then you don't get succession. So I hope that I've worked in Levers, which produces a whole bunch of talent. Every time there's a need for a new managing director or chairman, there are at least 2 candidates, and so on and so forth. Talent density, candor.
That's a wonderful summing up. There is one piece of statistic which you gave, that the 6 companies which you researched constitute more than 1/3 of the market capitalization
of BSE, yes.
Of BSE. For me, it's a sad reflection, because it means that there is so much value out there, but we are not doing enough research on that value to bring it out and get it represented as market capitalization. Am I right in that?
Vikram, you're dead right. And one of the purposes of our doing this research and writing these books, it's been a hell of a job trying to for me as a practitioner to work with 5 academics and for 5 academics to work with a practitioner. But it's been worth our effort because that's exactly our point. India needs not 6 institutions, but 60, 600 institutions. And I'm encouraging SP Jain and other management institutions to do their own research. And when we talk of top leadership training, it is not on the good old stuff that was taught in Harvard Business School with their case studies 10, 15 years ago. But what in India can you do to make an institution of your company? And you're right. I would like very much that the percentage of market cap. I wish these companies had only been 10% of the market cap. And you say there's a scope for so much more. I told you we have 69 million enterprises, of which 19,000 have a capital of more than 10 crores. What are we talking about? We are a land of pygmies with 1 or 2 giants. We need more giants, good giants.
More of them. That's true.
One question is, was endomania a common trait in all the 6 institutions, or was it a passion that drove the entrepreneurs?
The passion of the entrepreneur obviously has a very important role, no question. I judge eudaimonia of a company by the employee engagement. How employees think about it. HDFC employees are not the best paid in the financial services market, but they love the company. TCS doesn't pay the highest in the software industry, but their attrition rate is the lowest. Hindustan Lever recruits a lot of people. It's not a subject of our company, but like McKinsey, Hindustan Lever, people form a alumni association. They love the company. And you must love something to have eudaimonia, You must love your family, you must love society, you must love your neighbors. If you have no love in you, there is no eudaimonia. And so it is not a great metric, but it's a good marker. You must really love it. And love not in the bhakt sense, in the political bhakt sense. Love in an emotional sense.
Yeah. So are you suggesting that these companies which place a lot of value in eudaimonia are concerned more about the welfare and the happiness of their employees rather than the monetary compensation? And that's the root for an enduring value.
No, I wouldn't say they are concerned more about one or the other. Firstly, if you go and talk to these 6 people and say, I heard Gopalakrishnan say the other day that you're obsessed with eudaimonia, they say, what the hell does that mean? It's not a word that they have used. It's a word that I have used. But your question is, they really believe that the satisfaction of their employees, their customers, their shareholders, their community will automatically lead to profit. Whereas many of our private sector enterprises think that if I have the profit, then I can afford to do these things.
Yes.
Question is, which is the chicken, which is the egg? And I'm trying to illustrate that if you do the right things, then the right result can come. It's just like the way you raise your child. But if your child keeps getting 95% in all his subjects through means which he keeps away from you, then you have a cause to worry. So they are very, very, very obsessed. All of them do employee engagement surveys by one measure or the other. All of them spend time talking to people saying, how can I do things better? What am I doing wrong? And people talk to them. If we could replicate this on a national scale, it would be, we will have a eudaimonia country, the Gandhian country.
That's true.
One important question that is asked is, why is being entrepreneur not the primary thing for the Indian?
I think this is an act of evolution. When I was a young man of 25, if I said I'm an entrepreneur, unless I belong to the Chettiar community or the Gujarati Baniya community, any Tamil Brahmin would hesitate to give his daughter in marriage to me. If that's a marker at all. If I said I'm an IPS or IAS or a professor, they'll very happily give their daughter in marriage. That's not the situation today. And therefore, it's an evolutionary process. You know, if 50 years ago, I told my grandmother I'm working in a buffalo meat factory making leather hides, she would be absolutely horrified that a decent Brahmin boy is doing this. Today, he'll say, I did my MBA, I did leather technology, and I'm working in a buffalo meat factory. So bloody what, you know? So I think making an honest enterprise is becoming very, um, very laudable and is getting the recognition. It's a question of a little bit of time.
But isn't it also becoming more difficult in the current scenario?
What do you mean by current scenario?
Uh,
COVID, you mean?
the no, no,
No,
no,
no.
no.
Uh,
The political and the social factors that are at play.
You know, that's a question of how you look at it. In my view, there's a worldwide movement to get large corporations that's being led by large companies. They're very engaged in being sustainable, honest, and there are many fora in which they are doing this. And I think it's a movement. Like Gandhiji left Sabarmati Ashram with only 18 or 20 followers on his way to Dandi. By the time he reached Dandi, there were so many thousands or millions, the camera was not big enough to capture it. That's what we need. We are now sitting at this Gangotri of this movement. And I believe that if India finds the right way to promote enterprise, not just dismiss it as a nation of shopkeepers, Baniyas and Gujaratis and Marwadis and so on, and it will take 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but we'll be on the right track. Today, with due respect to our Prime Minister, the average person doesn't think they somehow think you're a crook. If you say your name is Patel or Gandhi or Chettiar or Kapoor, and people will say kuch gadbad hai, which is partly the result of various historical factors, but need not be a precursor of the future.
Yeah, that's right. There is one question here, which says that, but then how do you explain your model on the tremendous success of China in the last 3 years? I mean, last 3 decades? Because are they people oriented, or do they have people, the geologist and astronomer, as you said, and I mean, have they balanced short and long term? How do you explain China here?
No, I can't explain China with this because we set out to research Indian institutions in the Indian environment, and this cannot be applied to China. Indeed, if you applied it to United States, you may find some similarities, but not identical fit. It cannot apply to China. In China, the astronomer, the geologist is the mother, the father, everything is only one person. No? That's a different system. We have not researched it. I don't say that in disparagement, neither do I say it with admiration. I'm only accepting the reality that it's a different system. With the genius of India will be released when we understand the peculiarities of India and pander to that. And that is a small step that we are taking in the research that we have done and the books that we have published.
I just have one last question. I think there's an interesting question here. What is your idea on e-commerce? And is it a different business model which will shape the future differently from for the same endurance we are talking about?
From the same?
These enduring values, are they change? Do they change in an e-commerce situation?
Firstly, I think e-commerce will make a big impact on the way retail, grocery, and so on is done. So let's not get into that. Enduring values don't come to sectors. Enduring values come to companies. And if many companies in a sector adopt enduring values, then the sector will also get an enduring value image. I'll give you an example. Software companies are all young. Many of them are come under NASSCOM. NASSCOM came up, it's also a Gen L association. It's not like CII or FICCI or anything. NASSCOM adopted certain principles. And many people in software, I wouldn't say all, adopt and follow those practices. The software industry today has a clean image compared to the mining companies, as an example. So I don't believe e-commerce companies in a generic way can be said to be adopting the right values. The current phase of the e-commerce companies is that there are four phases in the evolution of a company. There is the pioneer phase, there's the adventurer phase, there's a pioneer phase, there's a consolidation phase, and then there's a growth phase. They are in the very early stages. So they are like the pirates. And I don't use that in a bad sense, who are exploring the Wild West in America back in the 1870s, 1880s. And it will settle down.
Yeah.
They're, as you know, all these companies are under tremendous pressures. The FANG companies, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and so on. That's a different subject, and I don't want to stray into that. They're going through a phase. But I cannot give generically good marks or bad marks to e-commerce companies. And I think there's a great future for them.
Yes, Ajay.
Ram, would you like to ask anything before we close?
You're muted, Ram.
One of the viewers had that what did the shapers of these companies do about gender inclusivity, and if I can add things like diversity, because you said that all of them are people oriented in some ways. So this person's question is about gender inclusivity. I would add, general diversity, because that's something that is important these days.
To be honest, I must say that this is not a subject on which we have a great deal of depth of data. I found that they were all empathetic to it. I saw that some companies like TCS recruit 35-40% of their input pipe has women. So also in banking, you'll find a large number of people. But when I go to so also in consumer goods companies, in the marketing, in the market research, in the those kinds of roles, finance. But I did not see anything overpoweringly significant, good or bad, that I can report upon to that question. I do believe gender diversity is a slow evolution subject, much as one would like to speed it up, whether it's women board directors or. But then that's the answer to your question. From my research, I'm not able to say anything very specific. I can only say that the authorship was fully gender diverse. Of the 6 authors of these books, 4 were women and only 2 were men.
More than diverse.
That is absolutely amazing.
And I can tell you, people are all made differently. I could write a book, a little essay on what plight Draupadi must have faced. Because here I was dealing with women who were in the majority. But I must say that we had a very good time working together, all of us, with our diverse views. And the fact that we were able to take, one of them is an economist, 2 of them were behavioral scientists, one was an entrepreneurship professor, and one was a behavioral person. To put all these people together and get similar themed books was a very interesting process, both for them and for myself.